In July of 1972, two teenagers going on a fun trip in Martin County stuck out their hands looking to hitchhike to the nearest beach. As they waited along the side of the road, they saw a police car approaching them. They asked a police officer to give them a ride to Stuart, which is the main city in and the seat of Martin County, Florida. Pamela Sue Wells and Nancy Trotter were quite happy to find such a cooperative police officer. He drove them to Stuart. During the ride, the girls told the police officer that they were not residents of Florida and they would love to have a guide to help them see its beautiful sights. The police officer, Gerard Schaefer, told the girls that he would take them to the beach the very next day. Meanwhile, he told them that it was dangerous to hitchhike in an unknown area. The girls weren't the least bit worried, as they knew that they were safe under the due diligence of a police officer. The girls were so excited to visit Jensen Beach that they accepted Schaefer's offer. The two parties decided to meet at a bandstand on East Ocean Boulevard at 9:15 a.m. Pamela and Nancy arrived at the location the next day and found that the nice policeman was already waiting for them. However, he was not wearing his uniform and had a different car. Schaefer explained to the girls that he was working undercover and did not want to risk bringing the police car. The girls accepted the explanation and sat in the car. They knew that the police officer was reliable and would take them to Jensen Beach in no time. However, as the girls were planning to enjoy the beach, Schaefer took a sharp turn to show the girls an old Spanish fort. At that point, Pamela and Nancy became suspicious of their benefactor. As they sat in the car, they did not know what would happen next. Welcome back to Twisted Minds. My name is James, and today we are going to explore the workings of a necrophiliac mind in the case of Gerard John Schaefer and find out what happened to the sweet teenagers, Pamela and Nancy. The man known as the Killer Cop, or the Hangman, was born in March 1946 in Neenah, Wisconsin. As the first child of a traveling salesman, Schaefer always felt neglected. As he grew older, his parents welcomed two more children into their lives. As parents, Gerard John and Doris Marie were not the best role models when it came to shaping the lives of their children. Gerard John was an alcoholic who did not spare his wife and children in his drunken bouts and divorced Schaefer's mother after a few years. When Schaefer saw that his father beat his mother, he accepted the idea that it was normal to take out your frustrations on women. This idea of treating women, especially girls, in demeaning ways was further cultivated in his adolescence and developed into a gruesome urge. Schaefer himself would also get beaten by his father and described his childhood as troubled and turbulent. He felt that his sister was given more attention and love as compared to him. Whether this perception was true or not, Schaefer believed it to be true and called himself the illegitimate product of a forced marriage. Adding to the routine of abuse and drunkenness, the Gerard family was always on the move. It is not difficult to perceive what Schaefer and his siblings may have felt when they were moving from one place to another at a whim. The disorientation of changing your home, friends, and memories after a few months or even years would have been traumatic for the three children. Schaefer's siblings may have coped well with the changing moves and moods of their father, but he could not. Even when he attended the Marist Academy as a child, he wasn't openly part of a group of friends or cliques. Instead, he internalized a desire to indulge in sexual fantasies, bordering on a psychopathic level. By the time the Gerard family permanently moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida in 1960, the damage was done. Schaefer had become obsessed with guns and violence. He had a collection of guns. He was also fond of hunting and fishing. These two pastimes were the only times Gerard felt that he had a connection with his father. The two of them would spend hours enjoying the quiet of the water when fishing and the thrill of shooting the prey when they were hunting. With a passion for guns and hunting, Schaefer also felt particularly inclined toward nature. Although he wasn't completely isolated from his friends, he would enjoy a walk through the forest or a stroll amongst the trees. At that point, he also expressed a desire to become a forest ranger. He was a good student, as assessed by his performance at St. Thomas Aquinas High School. He was part of the football team and was also praised for his golfing skills. His teachers felt that he would become a respectable member of society. Little did they know that Schaefer had other ideas in mind. He graduated high school in June 1964 and started working as a fishing guide in Everglades. Things could have been different if Schaefer's father had preferred his family over alcohol. He was close with his mother. However, her protective nature did not help in quelling his unusual narcissism and sadistic inclinations. As Gerard Schaefer moved toward his teen years, his pathological desire to hurt others, especially women, was transformed into sexual fanaticism. He became deeply interested in the practice of sadomasochism, or BDSM, the often accepted form of sexual interactions in which people follow the rules of bondage, discipline, dominance, and submission was something exciting for the adolescent Schaefer. Since he did not have a partner with whom he could enjoy such activities, he chose to indulge himself. He used to wear women's underwear and use breath play, or autoerotic asphyxia. He would suffocate himself until he felt the release of endorphins to eventually reach an orgasm. In school, Schaefer was known as a peeping Tom, as he was in the habit of watching girls in a way that made them feel uncomfortable. He would stand on his head to look under the skirts of his female colleagues. Most girls tried to avoid any interaction with Schaefer, as they could not accuse him of being anything but an annoyance. One of Schaefer's classmates, Barbara Krolick, was reported as saying, "I can't remember him being friends with any of the guys. He was always on the outside looking in. The only thing I remember is that I always had to tuck my skirt under my legs because Schaefer would practically stand on his head to look up a girl's skirt." The telltale signs of a sexually sadistic psychopath were apparent in Schaefer's adolescent years. However, these signs went unnoticed because of an absent father and an overprotective mother. Schaefer was in college when he further developed these unusual fantasies. He attended Broward Community College as a social studies major in 1964. He got average grades during his time at Broward. He was able to apply for a scholarship at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton to further his studies. After he was successful in getting the scholarship, Schaefer continued his studies to get a Bachelor's of Arts in Education. By this time, everyone viewed him as a normal teenager, and if some people spotted any unusual behavior, they would chalk it up to the pangs of teenage urges. The most disconcerting thing about people with pathological desires is that they seem quite normal to others. They are so good at hiding their true personalities that people actually like them. If you were to take a walk with Gerard Schaefer in his late teens, you would never know that the lanky fellow would one day become a serial killer. Schaefer was likable and friendly, and even enjoyed the non-profit organization Up With People. He went on an international tour to promote youth empowerment in 1966. When he came back, he was optimistic about finding a job. He moved in with his mother and began to fill out applications to get his dream job. During his time at Florida Atlantic University, Schaefer began dating Martha Marty Louise Fogg. She was 2 years junior to Schaefer and was part of a singing troupe, Sing Out 66. Martha was initially unaware of her boyfriend's sexual fantasies and was happy enough to agree to marry him in December 1968. The first signs of Schaefer's descent into darkness started appearing after his marriage. In his years as a bachelor, his desires and his penchant for violence were hidden from people. He did not have anyone with whom he could put his sadomasochism into practice. Once he got married, he got the perfect legal opportunity to transform his fantasies into reality. The couple moved to Southwest 22nd Street in Fort Lauderdale, where they spent a few months in peace until Schaefer started to make unusual demands from his wife. He would ask her to participate in the unusual practices of bondage and BDSM. Martha could not take the humiliation and torturous treatment for long and finally applied for divorce. The couple separated on May 2nd, 1970. Martha cited extreme cruelty for the reason for divorce. Soon after the divorce, Schaefer moved on to another relationship with a disabled woman. But given his knack for unusual sexual demands, the relationship fizzled out. Before becoming a police officer, Schaefer tried his hand at marriage a second time. He met a 19-year-old secretary named Teresa Dean when he was working as a security guard in January 1971. Both parties were infatuated with each other and married in September. Schaefer's second marriage was blissful as long as his wife submitted to his excessive demand for sex. Teresa was also a fan of fishing in the Florida Keys. Gerard Schaefer's teachers were right to point out that he had a bright future. He was good at his studies and had a passion for learning. If it hadn't been for his twisted sense of pleasure, he may have led a completely normal life. A successful one at that. The basis for this supposition rings true when you review the fact that when Schaefer applied for a teaching position, he was readily accepted. He started his career on September 23, 1969, as a teaching intern at Plantation High School as a teacher of geography. The principles that he chose to preach to his students, however, did not make sense to his colleagues. Several parents were quite disturbed by the things Schaefer was relaying to his students. When the complaints from both parents and colleagues started coming in, the administration had no choice but to fire Schaefer from his role as a geography teacher. He was not following the protocols of teaching in the conventional sense and tried to impose his own twisted morality on his students. Richard Goodhart, who was Schaefer's supervisor, was horrified by the experience of hiring him. He expressed his concern in an encyclopedia of modern serial killers by saying, "He'd better never let me hear of his trying to get a job with any authority over other people. I'd do anything I could to prevent it." Little did Richard know that his worst fears about Gerard Schaefer would come true. He would take on a position that provided him the freedom as well as the authority to pursue his heinous crimes. When Schaefer was fired from his job as a teacher, he started to apply for the position of police officer. The law enforcement agency is always on the lookout for fine young gentlemen who can serve the country with all their zeal. This zesty young man was not considered for the part of police officer in Broward County, but he didn't give up hope. He applied for a vacancy in the Wilton Manors Police Department on September 1st, 1970. He did not reveal that he had been discharged from 2 teaching positions. Instead, stated that he had 2 years of experience as a research assistant at FAU and told the police department that he had come from the US from Morocco. His application was accepted. He graduated in September 1971 as a patrolman. Even though he had been fired from his previous place of employment, he was able to convince the Wilton Manors Police Department to hire him as a cop in March 1972. He was 25 at the time and seemed to be the perfect candidate for the job. However, Gerard could not keep up the facade for long. His sexual urges got the better of him, and he started looking up the personal information of local women on the department's computer. He would ask these women on dates. If by chance some of these women responded, he would take them for a ride in his cop car, and they would end up missing. After 6 months had passed, the Wilton Manors Police became aware of Gerard's contemptible activities. They fired him on the spot. Gerard, however, was not one to give up on his quest to indulge his sexual fantasies. He had found the perfect cover in the form of a police officer. After he was let go from his job, he applied for another role in the police department. This time he was able to secure a job at the Martin County Sheriff's Office in Stuart, Florida in June 1972 by forging a letter of recommendation from his former boss. By the time Gerard became a cop, hitchhiking was becoming a trend in the States. People would go out on a whim and ask strangers to give them a lift. This trend became so common that it was not considered the least bit dangerous. Schaefer knew this all too well and used this new fad to feed his voyeuristic ambitions. He would pick up women and take them on a joyride until he found a secluded area to fulfill his sexual desires. two girls were around the age of 17 and 18. Not a very mature age to be going hitchhiking. However, as I explained earlier, hitchhiking was a trend back in the 70s, and no one would think it awkward for two girls to take a ride with a stranger. As Schaefer stopped near the two girls in June 1972, they asked him to give them a ride. Schaefer was more than happy to oblige. However, he would not take the girls by force, as he was in his police uniform and was driving a federally owned vehicle. When the girls sat in the car, Schaefer, who seemed to be a responsible police officer, told them about the dangers of hitchhiking. He went further in warning the teenagers that hitchhiking was illegal and that he could arrest them for the offense. But since he was a kind and dutiful police officer, he would simply let them off with a warning. Clear authority manipulation here. He cheated his way into seeming trustworthy. While driving to their destination, Pamela and Nancy started talking about their plans to visit Jensen Beach. Of course, Schaefer could not help but overhear their plans. He told them that he could take them to the beach the next day. The girls were overjoyed. They felt so lucky to find a gentleman in the form of a police officer. They decided on a time and location. The next day, Schaefer was prepared to put his plan into action. Instead of taking the police car, he chose to drive his own car and wear plain clothes. When the girls reached the bandstand on East Ocean Boulevard at 9:15 a.m., they saw Gerard without the police car or uniform and were somewhat confused. Schaefer saw that they were somewhat stressed, so he calmed them down by saying that he was on an undercover assignment and did not want the suspects to know that he was a police officer. The naive girls accepted the explanation and sat in the car. After driving for a few minutes, Schaefer suddenly changed gears and took the girls down an unknown road. Since both Pamela and Nancy were new to Florida, they did not spot the unusual change in the route. Gerard told them that he was taking them to see an old Spanish fort near Hutchinson Island. The girls were excited and did not think much of the change of plans. Meanwhile, Schaefer started advising them about the evils of hitchhiking. He told the girls that if they continued to take rides from strangers, they might end up getting abducted and sold into white slavery. The irony of this situation, dear viewers, is that Schaefer was warning the girls of a situation that they were already in. The car came to an abrupt halt. Schaefer took the two girls out of the car. He tied their hands behind their backs and gagged them with a piece of cloth and hauled them toward a worn-out shed in the forest. He then proceeded to tie one of them to a cypress tree near the Indian River and hung a noose around her neck. He used the rope of the noose to tie her legs under her knees and forced her to stand up on the exposed roots of the trees. If the girl had not stood up as she was tied, the noose would have tightened around her neck and she would have died on the spot. He took the other girl to a short tree and tied her with a noose hanging over a branch, forcing her to stand on a type of plinth made from the tree's roots. After securing the ties of both the girls, Schaefer was about to start his BDSM sexual ritual. He told the girls that he was about to play out his sexual fantasies and murder them in cold blood. It is hard to imagine how frightened and shocked the two girls would have been. If it had not been for the gags in their mouths, they would have shouted for help. However, the two girls did not need to shout. As luck would have it, Schaefer's radio dispatch intercom started beeping. He was told to return to the police station right away. Whatever the cause of the dispatch, Gerard had to leave the two girls behind. He told the girls, "I gotta go." As he was walking away from the location, Schaefer warned the girls not to try to run away because he was not going far down the road. When Schaefer was out of sight, the two girls struggled to get out of their bonds. They had to be very careful. One wrong move and they would be hanging from the tree from which they were tied to. Pamela Wells loosened her hands from the rope and slowly took her neck out of the noose. She ran toward the highway on Hutchinson Island. She cried for help and waited for someone to cross the road. As she was waiting for a vehicle, she was terribly frightened and was shaking from the trauma of the experience. She soon saw a truck approaching her and was able to stop it. She asked the truck driver to take her to the nearest police station, which was the same police station where Gerard Schaefer worked. Meanwhile, Nancy Trotter was able to get out of the noose but could not untie her hands. She jumped into the river nearby with her hands cuffed behind her back. She knew that the thin barrier of the Hutchinson Island stretched from Fort Pierce to Stuart, Florida. If she swam along the current of the river, she would be able to reach safety. I knew it was a peninsula that I was on, and if I followed the river, there would be a place where I would be able to look across the river and see the road. I finally got to a place where I could see the road on the other side. So I walked out into the river and just started swimming. She swam along the river and tried to reach the river bank as best as she could. As she struggled to get out of the river, she kept shouting and asking for help until Martin County Sheriff Robert Crowder heard her pleas. He helped her out of the water and took her back to the police station. When Schaefer went back to the hut, he realized that the girls had escaped. He tried to cover for himself by just telling Crowder that he was just trying to teach the girls a lesson against hitchhiking and went a bit far. "I've done something foolish," Schaefer told his boss. "You're going to be mad at me." He said that he had overdone his job in trying to scare the girls out of hitchhiking in the future for their own good. Crowder was not the least bit convinced and fired Schaefer immediately. Gerard Schaefer was taken into custody and charged with aggravated assault and false imprisonment. He was later released on bail to the tune of $15,000. The grave mistake of letting a potential sex offender out on bail would lead to the loss of 2 precious lives. After almost 2 months on bail, Gerard found 2 new victims on September 27, 1972. Unfortunately, Susan Place and Georgia Jessup were not as lucky as Nancy and Pamela. The 16-year-old Georgia Mary Jessup and Susan Place were attending an adult center of education. They met a guy in his 20s who went by the name Gerard Schaefer. The girls and Jerry soon became friends. Susan's mother, Lucille, found Jerry and Susan in her daughter's room. She asked the girls about Jerry, who was the epitome of a gentleman. However, Lucille was still suspicious of the unknown 20-year-old man in her house. Susan and Georgia asked Lucille to let them visit the beach with Jerry. Lucille did not want her innocent daughter and her friend to leave the safety of her home with a strange man. However, she could not resist her daughter's mischievous smiles and constant requests and allowed the trio to go to the beach. What was the harm, Lucille Place must have thought when the 3 of them were leaving? Susan and Georgia were used to going out without adult supervision, and Jerry seemed like an upright man. However, she could not ignore her maternal instinct and wrote down the registration number of Jerry's car. The 2 girls and Gerard Schaefer left the Place residence at 8:45 p.m. Lucille waited throughout the day and subsequent night for her daughter to return. When she did not come back after 4 days, she called Georgia Jessup's mother. Shirley Jessup told Lucille that her daughter had run away from home on September 27th. When Lucille explained the whole thing to Shirley, both parents were worried sick. Shirley Jessup later explained, "I never met Gerard Schaefer, but Georgia told me that he was a real nice guy and smart." The parents filed a report with the police that their daughters were missing, but it was too late. Gerard Schaefer, aka Gerard Schaefer, had already taken the girls to Oakland Park near Fort Lauderdale. Instead of going to the beach, he had taken a sharp turn toward the woods. He gagged the 2 girls and tied them to a tree. After binding them firmly to a tree, he started to take off their clothes. He took his sweet time to take sexual advantage of Susan Place, as police found her clothes in a pile near her skeletal remains. Once he reached his climax, he moved on to Georgia Jessup, who was wearing jeans with a Roadrunner emblem on them. Schaefer took off her shirt and continued to torture the poor girl as he enjoyed his sexual exploits. Once he satisfied his urges, he continued to torture them until they died. The police later found out that Susan Place had been shot in the jaw. In order to hide his heinous crimes, Schaefer dismembered the girls' bodies. He took out a machete and cut the dead girls' bodies into pieces and buried them in Oakland Park. He wanted to remove all the evidence that could link him to the crime. Police investigations revealed that the spinal cords of the 2 girls were cut at the lumbar and cervical section. and the remaining bones were crushed with a knife. The account of the gruesome act was shared by Schaefer himself in one of his letters to Shonda London. When I nabbed Jessup in place, I had been in the ghoul game for almost 10 years, so I knew what to expect from these juicy young creatures at the end. Doing doubles is far more difficult than doing singles, but on the other hand, it also puts one in a position to have twice as much fun. There can be some lively discussions about which of the victims will get to be killed first. When you have a pair of lively teenage bambalinas bound hand and foot and ready for a session with the skinning knife, neither one of the little devils wants to be the one to go first, and they don't mind telling you quickly why their best friend should be the one to die. As the girls' parents were looking for them, their remains were rotting away under 6 feet of mud. Place and Jessup's parents had given the registration number of the car and the supposed residential information of Jerry Shepherd to the police. However, the authorities could not find any evidence of the vehicle or the address. The police thought that the case was cold until evidence was found a year later in 1973. Gerard Schaefer was not one to sit back when he was accused of killing several women. He would file frivolous lawsuits against anyone who accused him of a crime. However, when he would later talk to his cellmates in private, he would boast about the fact that he had killed over 80 girls and women. The police figures maintain that the actual number of killings at the hand of Gerard John Schaefer was 30. He would relate in private letters to his attorneys that he was not lying when he said he had killed over 80 women, including pregnant women. He would let them vomit and suffer in their final moments in their own fecal matter. Many of his sketches show women defecating themselves and taking their last breaths. Schaefer was fascinated with the process of death, and once his victims died from hanging, suffocation, or the burden of torture, he would wait for them to turn cold. When he was satisfied that they were dead, he would return to defile them once more. He would take off their clothes and enjoy himself by having intercourse in various positions. He wrote on January 20th, 1991, "I've always harped on District Attorney Robert Stone's list of 34. In 1973, I sat down and drew up a list of my own. As I recall, my list was just over 80. He continued to muse on his mass murders the next day by writing, "I'm not claiming a huge number. I would say it runs between 80 and 110. But over 8 years and 3 continents. One whore drowned in her own vomit while watching me disembowel her girlfriend. I'm not sure that counts as a valid kill. Did the pregnant ones count as 2 kills? It can get confusing." When police raided his home, they found evidence in the form of numerous belongings of various women. These included jewelry, clothing, shoes, and even handbags. He had even given one of the purses of his victim, Nancy Place, to his second wife. The 2 girls, Nancy, who was 21, and Pamela, then 20 years of age, had gone swimming on October 2nd, 1966, to enjoy an evening with their boyfriends. Nancy was a 1963 graduate of Largo High, and Pamela was working as a nurse at Morton Plant Hospital. The casual evening did not go according to plan. The girls felt that the water was too cold and did not want to go for a swim. Their boyfriends, on the other hand, jumped into the water and started swimming. When they came out of the water, there was no sign of Nancy or Pamela. They canvassed the whole area of Alexander Springs Recreational Area of the Ocala National Forest in Lake County. However, the only things that they could find were the girls' purses and shoes. Schaefer later confessed to the abduction of the 2 girls at gunpoint and killing them in Ocala National Forest. Their belongings were also found in a police raid at Gerard's mother's place. Ken Adams, an investigator with the Lake County Sheriff's Office, recovered details of Schaefer's conversation with inmate Charles Sizelove, in which Schaefer openly confessed to the crime. Adams was relieved after finding the facts and said, "In these materials are found various sources of relatively strong circumstantial evidence that I think clearly point to Gerard Schaefer as the most likely killer of these two young women. Lee Farrell Hainline Boner Dees was only 24 when she became a victim at the hands of Gerard Schaefer. She went missing in September 1969 and was Schaefer's neighbor. He had often complained that Boner Dees was taunting him by keeping the curtains open while she changed her clothes. When Lee went missing, Gerard was one of the suspects, but Lee's family did not file any charges. Her skeletal remains were found 9 years later, and Schaefer was charged with Lee's alleged murder and sexual crimes. Carmen Candy Hallock worked as a cocktail waitress in Fort Lauderdale. On December 18, 1969, she called her sister-in-law to tell her about a meeting with a school teacher from a junior high. She explained that the teacher had experience as an undercover agent for the government and wanted to offer her a job. When Carmen didn't come home, her sister-in-law went to visit her apartment. The place was completely empty, and there was no sign of Carmen. Her car keys, driver's license, and vehicle registration were missing, along with her black cocktail dress and black high-heel shoes. The police found her car in a parking lot. The search for Carmen became a cold lead. After 10 years, in January 1978, Carmen's skeletal remains were found in Boca Raton, Florida, in the subdivision of Boca del Mar. When the police were investigating the murders committed by Gerard Schaefer, they found Carmen's gold-filled tooth and hairpins in her apartment. However, there was not enough evidence to convict Schaefer of the crime. A 22-year-old cocktail waitress named Belinda Hutchinson disappeared on January 5, 1972. She was last seen in a car with a stranger who drove a blue Datsun. Since Belinda was known for her involvement in prostitution, no one gave much thought when she sat in the car with a stranger. No one saw her after that day. Gerard Schaefer was suspected of killing the 22-year-old woman because her husband told the police that she was dating the rogue ex-cop. Gerard Schaefer was under suspicion of killing Barbara Ann Wilcox and Colette Goodenough in January 1971. Both girls were raped and murdered in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Pieces of their IDs were found in Gerard's home during the investigation of Place and Jessup's murder. Schaefer was also under suspicion of the murder of 14-year-old Mary Briscolina and 13-year-old Elsie Farmer from Broward County in October 1972. Their skeletal remains were found early in 1973. However, police could not determine the cause of death, and there were no official charges made against Gerard Schaefer. Gerard was not satisfied with just fantasizing about torturing women and girls. He had to record his twisted thoughts in the form of short stories. These stories depicted women and girls being hanged and tortured in various positions. The most reoccurring theme of these stories was of women urinating themselves while being hung from a noose. Schaefer's sense of deprivation and hatred of women was visible in their depiction of the most humiliating positions. He later confessed that he would love to make women drink water before killing them so that he could see them urinate. One of his tales, Murder Demons, was a true crime fiction that revealed his specific method of taking sexual advantage over and killing his victims. It was also instrumental in convicting him of the multiple murders. The sketches made by Schaefer showed women in various positions. He depicted himself as a rogue ex-cop, whereas the women were depicted as bound in unusual positions with their heads cut off. One particularly disturbing image, titled Killer Art, shows a woman with her breasts and nipples hanging out as she is tied to a cross. Her head is cut off from the rest of her body. You can see the blood trickling onto her body and reaching her legs. Another sketch shows a naked woman hung upside down from a tree with her breasts and feet tied separately. Schaefer has entitled the image, "I am the master of the cult." Lucille Place was always on the lookout for evidence against her daughter's killer. She was certain the man named Jerry Shepard was the one responsible for her disappearance. Soon enough, she found a letter written by Gerard Schaefer to her daughter in March 1973. She decided to find the address on her own. When she finally drove to the location, she found out that the real name of the owner of 333 Martin Avenue was Gerard Schaefer. She was astonished to find out that the man was in prison due to the charges of abduction and attempted hanging of 2 girls. When Lucille and her husband Ira were trying to connect the 2 persons, namely Jerry and Gerard, they came to the realization that investigations had not properly recorded the registration number of the car. They had recorded the number under Pinellas County instead of Martin County. The observant couple found out that license plates in Martin County started with the number 42, whereas registration numbers in Pinellas County started with 4. When she informed the police, they found out that the blue-green Datsun was registered to one Gerard Schaefer, who resided at 333 Martin Avenue. She also provided a picture of Gerard Schaefer to confirm her allegations that Jerry was actually Gerard. As luck would have it, a father and son went to Oak Hammock Park, Port St. Lucie, Florida, to search for aluminum cans the next month. Instead of cans, their devices started to show unusual readings. When they removed the earth from the spot, they found the skeletal remains of 2 individuals in the ground. The grave of the 2 humans was 2 feet and 3 inches deep. The father and son also found deep scratch marks near the gravesite where parts of a torso were tied to the base of a tree trunk. The bones of one individual were covered by blue jeans with a famous Looney Tunes character, Roadrunner. The second set of bones did not have any clothes. Instead, the clothes were found in a pile nearby, and the rest of the remains were scattered by wild animals. These skeletal remains were found 6 miles from the place where Nancy Trotter and Susan Wells were gagged and tied to 2 trees. The remains showed that Place and Jessup were tied and killed at the spot. Their spinal cords were cut. Their backbones were laid in pieces on the forest floor. They were decapitated after they died, and their jawbones were damaged. The most alarming and deciding factor in convicting Gerard Schaefer was the initial GJ, short for Gerard John, engraved into the tree trunk. The fact that the base of the tree trunk had multiple deep knife, machete, and axe incisions containing clothing fibers showed that it was Schaefer's favorite place to rape and kill his victims. The skeletal remains found in Oakland Park were sent to the Dade County Medical Examiner's Department. Dr. Richard Souverin performed an autopsy and process of identification on the bones. He found that the remains belonged to Place and Jessup through dental records and healed bone fractures on April 5, 1973. When the identifications were made, Schaefer was already in prison for the Trotter and Wells abduction. He was informed that he had been charged with the murder of 2 girls. As soon as Schaefer heard the news, he asked for a public defender because he knew that the truth would eventually come to light. Elton Schwartz was chosen as his public defender and tried determinedly to get him off. The modus operandi, or MO, of Gerard Schaefer was to lure innocent teenagers with promise of high-paying jobs or simply a good time. He cashed in on the hitchhiking trend to target and capture girls between the ages of 16 to 25. Most of his victims would be enamored with his personality, as he was perfect at portraying a trustworthy gentleman. The pattern of luring young women, gagging, and tying them to tree trunks led to Schaefer's final indictment. As a murderer, he was meticulous, but he could not resist showing off his expertise in his writings. The police in Broward County and Martin County were able to link 2 incidences of the Place and Jessup murders and the Trotter Wells abduction. They got a search warrant to the house where Gerard was living with his wife and mother. When the police searched the apartment, they found several items belonging to multiple victims. Most of the items consisted of jewelry, teeth, purses, and other personal belongings of his victims. As the police dug deeper, they found a collection of vile sketches and disgusting descriptions of the murders committed by Schaefer. Some of them were detailed instructions on how to kill women, and others were similar recollections of the torture he had meted out to his victims. Schaefer was initially arrested for the abduction of Trotter and Wells. As he was passing his time in prison, Jessup's parents provided new evidence of Schaefer's involvement in the girl's murder. He was officially indicted in 1973 after a lengthy trial. In December 1972, Schaefer appeared in court for the Trotters and Wells abduction. Due to a plea bargain, which his attorney strongly recommended he accepted, Schaefer was able to plead guilty to just one charge of aggravated assault, for which he received a sentence of 1 year in jail with the possibility of parole after 6 months, to be followed by 3 years probation. However, the judge accepted his explanation of teaching the girls a message and let him off with a warning. When Judge D.C. Smith gave the ruling on Schaefer's case, he spoke directly to the misguided murderer by saying, "It is beyond the court's imagination to conceive how you were such a foolish and astronomical jackass as you were in this case." The judge's statement shows that Schaefer was considered a law-abiding police officer who was just a little crazy. No one took his heinous act seriously. If they had dug deeper, they would have found the source of the problem and prevented Gerard from pursuing his vile ambitions. Instead, the judge allowed the formal sentencing to be postponed until after the holidays. Schaefer started to serve his sentence in Martin County Jail on January 15, 1973. Schaefer was so pleased with himself that he had gotten away with abducting Nancy and Pamela that he tried to cement his innocence in front of the media. When he was leaving the court on December 22nd, he claimed to reporters that, "I made a stupid mistake. There was no sex involved. No one was hurt.
I didn't do it. I don't think the state has proved that I did it in any way. And the testimony of my witnesses is counteracted the testimony of the other witnesses."
It was only after a detailed and thorough investigation of Place and Jessup's murder that Schaefer was officially charged with second-degree murder on May 12, 1973. The overwhelming evidence provided by the two girls' mothers and the evidence found in Schaefer's room led to his conviction. Although Schaefer had committed multiple murders, he was only convicted on 2 counts of murder. However, these 2 counts were enough to send him away with a lifetime imprisonment. When the investigation team took Schaefer in, they did not know how many murders they would uncover. They were unaware of the gruesome nature of his sexual desires and his history of self-torture. From an early age, Dr. R.C. Eaton explained in a 1973 recording, Schaefer has had numerous sexual hang-ups. He started his experimentation with bondage and sadomasochism around the age of 12. According to Dr. Mordecai Harbour, Schaefer explained that, "I'd tie myself up to a tree and I'd get excited sexually and do something to hurt myself." He hated his family, his sister, and even himself. His strange imaginations led him to masturbate and fantasize about hurting other people, women in particular. He had developed an underwear fetish, as he recalled. "I discovered women's underwear panties. Sometimes I wore them." The absence of his father had left a deep mark on his personality. He was sick and tired of the attention given to his sister and would take out his frustration through his childhood games. He expressed his pains through these games by telling Dr. Haber, "I always get killed. I wanted to die. My father favored my sister, so I wanted to be a girl. I wanted to die. I was such a disappointment to my family as a kid. To my father. He loved my sister. I couldn't please my father. So, in playing games, I wanted to be killed." In order to cure himself of his self-loathing and necrophiliac tendencies, Schaefer began to visit a psychiatrist in 1966. He explained his innermost dilemmas in hopes of curing them, but to no avail. The damage was permanent. The inclination toward killing and debasing women was ingrained in his brain. He would hear voices that would convince him to kill. That was also the point when he committed his first murder. He abducted Nancy Leichner and Pamela Nate and killed them in cold blood in 1966. He then traveled to the South with a group of moral rearmament. During his time with the cheery, up with people folks, he sang that freedom isn't free. This short respite allowed him to ponder upon his next venture. He returned with a zeal to become a priest and profess his ideas to the world. Schaefer also tried his hand at priesthood to change himself. His aim was to quell his sexual desires by practicing abstinence. If Schaefer had gone down the religious path, countless lives could have been saved. He would have become a man of faith and may have found peace. However, his true nature could not conform to the bindings of the Christian faith. When he called on the St. John's Seminary, they carried out an analysis of his personality. However, the pastor could not detect the humility and faith required for the priesthood in the unholy mind of Gerard John Schaefer. He expressed his disillusion with the church after rejection in the following words: "They said I didn't have enough faith." He was so devastated by the rejection that he quit the Catholic Church altogether and moved on to a path of evil. Gerard Schaefer's trial was nothing short of an adventure for the whole legal team. Although there was considerable physical and circumstantial evidence against Gerard, he had hired an excellent litigator. He was brought to trial on September 17, 1973, in St. Lucie County before Judge Trowbridge. Stone and Philip Shaler were part of the prosecution, and Schaefer was defended by Schwartz and Bruce Colton. At that point, the Supreme Court of Florida had declared the death penalty unconstitutional, and the only way Schaefer could be convicted was through life imprisonment. Schaefer pled not guilty to all charges against him. He was officially charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the killing of Place and Jessup. The defense built up by Schaefer's team was mostly focused on proving that the timeline of the murders did not coincide with Schaefer's presence in Fort Lauderdale. The trial started with the testimony of the 2 men who had found the skeletal remains of Place and Jessup in Oakland Park. They explained how they found the remains and contacted the police. Lieutenant David Yurchuk testified in the process of searching Schaefer's mother's place and the evidence found in the house. Dr. Richard Souverin's testimony was instrumental in proving Schaefer's guilt, as he had conducted the autopsies upon the victims and identified them through dental records and distinctive healed bone fractures. Schaefer's attorney, Elton Schwartz, tried to discredit the doctor's testimony by saying that the gunshot to Nancy's jaw was made with a .22 caliber instead of a .25 caliber cartridge that was found in Schaefer's possession. However, the doctor maintained that the shot was from Schaefer's gun. Nancy Trotter and Paula Wells testified against Schaefer, explaining how he gagged and hung them from a noose. A video depicting the method of gagging the victims was shown in court. Nancy emphasized how Schaefer had planned to kill both of them. When he had tied Nancy to the cypress tree, he had made a boast that he could dig a hole in which to bury her and Wells, and that nobody would ever find them. The prosecution provided evidence of the tree roots as well as the bark of the trees where the girls had been tied. A manuscript written by Schaefer also presented as evidence detailed the process of properly executing women. Schaefer's attorney dismissed all the evidence as circumstantial. However, the jury was not convinced of Schaefer's innocence just yet. After all the evidence was presented, both parties gave their closing statements. Prosecutor Philip Shaler said in his closing statement that it was the first anniversary of Place and Jessup's death. The fact that both Trotter and Wells escaped and were able to present Schaefer's MO was concrete evidence of his guilt. The prosecution asserted that they had successfully proven Schaefer's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt through physical evidence, DNA testing, and forensic evidence. Schwartz dismissed all the evidence as circumstantial. However, Stone, as part of the prosecution, rebutted Schwartz and gave an emphatic closing statement. Stone told the prosecutor that Schaefer acted as the prosecutor, judge, and executioner when he murdered Place and Jessup, In his final statement, Stone said, "I submit to you one more word, God," because he decided whether he was going to let them live or die. He became God. The jury began to deliberate on closing statements at 3:45 p.m. They took 5 hours and 10 minutes to come up with a unanimous verdict. Schaefer was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, which Judge Trowbridge formally announced to the court at 11:05 p.m. When Schaefer heard the final verdict, he told the reporters in his usual cold manner, "That's the roll of the dice. I had a good defense, but I'm innocent." Schaefer was given life imprisonment in the Florida State Prison. This was a sigh of relief for Place's mother, who expressed her contentment after the verdict. "At first, I thought I'd like to see him dead, but I think people suffer more with confinement. Death is the easy way out, just as long as he's never on the streets again." Once Gerard Schaefer was convicted and sent to jail, there was not much left in his life. His wife came to visit him just once to make her divorce official. The fact that he did not feel ashamed of himself or his crimes shows that he was beyond any rehabilitation or redemption. Even the police officers who were responsible for arresting and keeping him in jail admitted he was the most distorted and disgusting man they had ever encountered. Bill Haggerty, an ex-FBI agent, had observed and analyzed Schaefer for VICAP in early 1980s. In his opinion, Schaefer was one of the sickest. If I had a list of the top 5, which would include all of the serial killers I've interviewed throughout the country, he would definitely be in the top 5. Even in prison, Schaefer continued to boast of his crimes. He became a police informant to get privileges from prison staff. His devious nature led to many of his cellmates to develop a profound sense of hatred for him. He would use obscene comments to rile up fellow inmates until one of them had enough. During his time in prison, Gerard kept writing letters to his so-called fans. His sexual depravity was not confined to the 4 walls of the prison. He continued to request his correspondents to send him female underwear. He was so deeply entrenched in the idea of spreading his views on necrophilia and torture that he started writing a set of stories depicting these events. He was not the least bit ashamed of his crimes. He wanted people to enjoy the raw facts of necrophilia and realize the pleasure that he obtained from indulging in these despicable activities. He called this genre of writing killer fiction. He would describe the various ways in which he would kill his victims. Shonda London, a girl who Schaefer dated in high school before 1964, helped him publish these tales of torture. Schaefer continued to claim that all of the stories under the title of killer fiction and beyond killer fiction were a figment of his imagination and nothing else. However, police found several similarities between the stories and Schaefer's victims' remains. Shonda London soon realized that Schaefer was not simply an author of shocking stories. He was an actual murderer who was drawing on his experience of torturing and murdering women and girls to gain popularity. Schaefer revealed that he had started killing women in 1965 when he was only 19 in his private letters to London. He also admitted that he was responsible for the December 1969 disappearance of 2 schoolgirls, 9-year-old Peggy Wren and 8-year-old Wendy Stevenson. He declared that he abducted the 2 girls from Pompano Beach, murdered them, and ate them afterward. The horror and shock felt by London compelled her to publicly rebuke him as a ruthless murderer in 1991. Schaefer, enraged by the declaration, sued Shonda London for referring to him as a serial killer in the print media. The lawsuit was dismissed when London revealed the 500 pages of letters shared between herself and Schaefer, which described all his heinous acts in detail. Gerard Schaefer was found dead in his cell on December 3rd, 1995. The killer had stabbed him 40 times in the face, neck, head, and body. It seemed that someone had planned to murder him in cold blood and went all out while finishing the job. Schaefer's right eye was completely destroyed. His ribs were fractured, and as if the killer was not satisfied with bludgeoning him to death. He had slashed Schaefer's throat to make the final cut. The killer was identified as 32-year-old fellow inmate named Vincent Faustino Rivera. The police said that Vincent had killed Schaefer following an argument over taking the last cup of hot water from a dispenser, a few days before the murder. Vincent was convicted of murdering Schaefer and was given an additional 53 years and 10 months. For Shirley Jessup, still mourning her daughter, Schaefer's murder was simply a case of overdue justice. I'd like to send a present to the guy who killed him. I've always believed he was going to get his. I just wish it would have been sooner than later. Thanks for tuning in to Twisted Minds. That was the case of Gerard John Schaefer, and why don't you go ahead and click on one of the 2 videos on your screen for another one of our videos.